The sound of the front door closing behind us echoed more than it should have on such a quiet street. I turned to my husband, searching for an explanation, but all I got was his usual grin, the one I'd seen 1,000 times before. I thought we were supposed to be enjoying a simple night at home. That was my plan when I left work, exhausted and ready to dive into the weekend. Yet here I was, standing in front of a stranger's house, completely clueless about why we were there. "Trust me," he murmured, his hand resting gently on my lower back as he led me toward the door. The house was small, tucked away in a part of the city I didn't recognize, and something about it felt off. The porch light flickered weakly, casting just enough light to reveal the peeling paint on the door. I should have said something then, asked him what we were doing here, but for some reason I stayed silent. We'd been married for 6 years, long enough for us to fall into the familiar comfort of each other's presence, the steady rhythm of daily life. But lately there had been something different, a slight distance between us. It was subtle, like a loose thread in the background neither of us wanted to admit. So, when he suggested spending the evening with his friends, I figured this was his attempt at bridging the gap. I pushed my doubts aside and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the silence. There was no music, no chatter, just the faint hum of the fridge coming from the kitchen. 3 men were scattered across the living room, each holding a drink. As I walked in, they all turned to look at me. I didn't recognize any of them, but the way they glanced at me made me feel exposed, like I was under a spotlight despite the dim lighting. "Hey, you made it," one of them called out, stepping toward me. He was tall, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My husband gave him a brief nod, as if everything was perfectly normal. But I could feel the tension tightening in my chest. I forced a smile, trying to blend in. "Yeah, we're here." They offered me a drink, which I took without thinking. Just something to occupy my hands. My husband quickly joined in the conversation, laughing with the others about something I didn't catch. I stood there, feeling out of place, sipping my drink slowly, wondering why I wasn't more at ease. Everything about this felt staged. The way my husband moved through the room, so relaxed, so familiar with these men. How they kept glancing at me, but never too long. Just enough to make me feel like the only one who didn't know what was going on. I wanted to ask him what we were doing here. Why had he dragged me out when all I wanted was to stay home? But the words never came. There was something in the air, subtle but undeniable, telling me I wouldn't like the answer. So I stayed quiet, watching them laugh, trying to ignore the growing sense that something was wrong. One of the men, the one with the easy smile, moved closer, his eyes lingering on my face just a little too long. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. But there was something in it that sent a chill through me. I nodded, forcing another smile, but I could feel my heart racing. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't move, staying too close for comfort. "It's all right," he said. "You'll feel better soon." Before I could respond, my husband stepped in, clapping a hand on the man's shoulder, pulling him back into their conversation. I exhaled, surprised to realize I'd been holding my breath. What was going on? The evening dragged on, each minute feeling longer than the last. I felt trapped, caught between being polite and an instinct I didn't want to acknowledge. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, reading too much into things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a casual hangout. At one point, my husband caught my eye from across the room. For the first time that night, I saw something in his expression that unsettled me. It wasn't concern or care. It was curiosity, like he was waiting to see how I would react. I swallowed hard, tightening my grip on the glass in my hand. A cold shiver ran through me despite the warmth in the room. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm and distant. I nodded again, but I knew he didn't believe me, and I didn't believe myself. The tension was thick, suffocating. I could feel it in the way the men moved around me, in the way my husband smiled without his eyes ever softening. I should have left then, made an excuse, said I wasn't feeling well, anything to get out of there. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. The air was heavy with unspoken words, and all I could think was that I had no idea what was going to happen next. The cold from the night outside still lingered in the room, despite the warmth of all the bodies around me. I sat on the edge of the couch, legs pulled up like I was trying to shrink into myself. My husband was engrossed in conversation with one of the men, laughing about something I couldn't quite hear. Everything felt blurry, like I was watching through frosted glass. And then it happened. A moment so subtle, so quiet that I almost missed it at first. One of the other men, the one with dark eyes and a gravelly voice, leaned over from the armchair across from me. His hand brushed my arm lightly as he handed me a drink, and before I could even process the movement, he kissed me on the cheek. It was quick, almost innocent, like something you might expect from an old friend or distant relative you hadn't seen in ages. But it wasn't that. Not even close. My heart skipped, but I forced a smile. I glanced at my husband. Surely he'd seen that. He had to have. But he didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't break his conversation. He acted like nothing had happened, like it was perfectly normal for his friend to lean in that close to me, to kiss me without warning. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a casual gathering. This was something planned, something deliberate. My stomach twisted. I had to speak up. I had to make it clear that this wasn't okay, that I wasn't comfortable with this. But the words wouldn't come. They were stuck, thick like syrup in my throat. I scanned the room, hoping to find someone who could see what was wrong. Someone who could understand, but the other men seemed completely oblivious. Or worse, they were all part of it. I set my drink down on the table untouched, my hands trembling. The man who had kissed me flashed a slow smile, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. There was something unsettling about him, the way he held himself so confident, like he was enjoying some kind of game. But I wasn't playing along. I stood up, the need to move overwhelming me, to do something that would give me a sense of control again. I walked across the room, heading toward the small hallway that led to the kitchen. My breath was shallow, my pulse hammering in my temples. I just needed a moment, a second to collect my thoughts, to figure out what the hell was happening here. As I entered the kitchen, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, half expecting it to be my husband, but instead it was the man from the armchair, the one who had kissed me. He leaned casually in the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, watching me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I nodded, but it felt like a lie. "Yeah, just needed some air." He moved closer, slow and deliberate. "It's just a kiss. No big deal." The words made my stomach churn. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl, something that felt calculated. I forced myself to meet his gaze, even though every part of me screamed to look away, to run. "I don't think that's appropriate," I said, my voice trembling slightly. His smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You didn't seem to mind." Before I could react, he closed the distance between us, just enough that I could feel his presence, his breath against my skin. My heart raced, but I couldn't move, frozen by a mix of fear and confusion. I wanted to push him away, to shout for my husband to do something, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. And deep down I wondered if my husband would even care. That thought hit me harder than anything else. The realization that he had seen the kiss, seen how his friend was now standing too close, and yet had done nothing to stop it. Hadn't even acknowledged it. Had he wanted this? Was this part of the plan? I took a shaky breath, stepping back just enough to break his gaze. I needed to think, to understand what was happening. I couldn't confront him, not yet. Not when I didn't even know the rules of the game. He stared at me for a moment longer, his eyes never leaving mine, before he turned and walked back into the living room without a word. I was left alone in the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. What was going on? How had I ended up here, in this house, surrounded by strangers in a situation I couldn't make sense of? I remembered the moment my husband had suggested coming here. He had been so casual, so sure I'd say yes, and I had. I hadn't questioned it, hadn't pushed back. I had trusted him. But now I wasn't so sure. I pushed myself off the counter, wiping my damp palms on my jeans. I couldn't stay in the kitchen forever. I had to go back out there and face whatever this was. But as I stepped into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I wasn't ready for. I stepped back into the living room, my heart still pounding from the tension in the kitchen. The men were deep in conversation, laughing, while my husband sat on the couch with his usual relaxed smile. He looked up at me, but there was no sign of concern in his eyes. No hint that he noticed the unease I was feeling. His calmness, his detachment, made everything feel more unsettling than I cared to admit. I sat down quietly next to him, forcing a smile to match his. I didn't want to cause a scene. Not now, not when I didn't even know what I'd say. The night went on, and I did my best to keep the conversation light, avoiding eye contact with the man who had cornered me in the kitchen. Suddenly, my husband turned to me with an idea that felt completely out of place given the weirdness of the night. "Hey, how about we go to the water park tomorrow?" His voice was casual, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "A water park?" I repeated, surprise obvious in my voice. It was cold outside, hardly the time for water slides and wave pools. And why would he suggest something so normal after everything that had just happened? "Yeah, I think it would be fun. All of us," he said, gesturing to his 3 friends. "We haven't had a day out together in a while. I think it'd be good for us." I hesitated. The idea felt absurd after the tension of the evening. My mind was still spinning from everything that had happened, and now he wanted to pretend like none of it mattered. Like we could just go to the water park and forget about the weirdness of the night. But part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to go along with the idea that everything was fine. Maybe this could be a way to reset, to make things feel normal again. "I don't know." I started, but before I could finish he leaned closer. "Come on, it'll be fun. Promise. You'll feel better after." His voice softened, and something about it made me doubt my earlier feelings. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe I was reading too much into it. I nodded slowly. "All right. The water park then." The next day we piled into the car, and I found myself squeezed between my husband and one of his friends in the back seat. The drive to the water park was filled with light-hearted chatter, the kind you'd expect from old friends reminiscing about past adventures after what felt like days of silence. The knot in my stomach started to loosen, and the tension from the previous night seemed to melt away with each passing mile. When we arrived, the air was crisp, but not too cold, and the towering blue slides greeted us like some strange monument to summer fun. It had been years since I'd stepped foot in a water park, and as we walked in, a sudden wave of nostalgia hit me. The kind you get when you're reminded of simpler times, when everything was carefree and fun. I couldn't help but smile. We slipped into our swimsuits and made our way toward the lazy river. At first, the guys were just messing around, joking and splashing each other, and I found myself starting to relax. The sound of the water was soothing, like it was washing away some of the tension I'd been carrying. My husband floated beside me, his hand brushing mine every so often, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like everything was back to normal. Just the 2 of us enjoying the day like we used to. We spent hours bouncing from slide to slide, laughing as we were drenched by towering waterfalls and zoomed down the chutes at what felt like impossible speeds. I even let out a scream of pure excitement as I plummeted down one of the tallest slides. It was the kind of joy I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. To my surprise, I was actually having fun. After a while, we decided to take a break and grab some snacks. We found a shady spot to sit and catch our breath. As I looked around at the group, something shifted. For the first time since meeting my husband's friends, I didn't feel like an outsider. I didn't feel like I was on the outside looking in. One of the men, the one who had kissed me the night before, caught my eye. He was laughing with the others, and in the daylight, with everything so light-hearted and easy, he seemed almost harmless. It's strange how much a change in setting can shift everything. How the brightness of day can mask the heaviness from the night before. My husband nudged me with his elbow. "Having fun?" he asked, his voice warm. This time I smiled for real. "Yeah, I actually am. See? Told you this would be good for us," he grinned, and for the first time in a long while I actually believed him. As the afternoon wore on, we headed toward the wave pool, one of the last stops on our list before calling it a day. The water was cold as we waded in, but the waves were gentle, moving us back and forth in a calming rhythm. I leaned back, letting the water carry me, my eyes closed, letting the weight of everything from the last few days slip away. Maybe I had been overthinking it all. Maybe last night hadn't been as off as I thought. The way my husband had suggested this outing, how insistent he was, now it made sense. He just wanted us to reconnect, to remind me that everything was still okay. And maybe we were okay. By the time we left, the sun was setting, stretching long shadows across the parking lot. My muscles ached from all the fun we'd had, but it was a satisfying ache, the kind you get after exerting yourself in a way that feels good. On the drive home, the car was filled with light conversation and the soft hum of the road beneath us. My head rested against the cool glass of the window, and I let myself drift into a calm, peaceful haze. It felt like everything was okay. At least that's what I told myself. But as soon as we stepped inside our house, that sense of calm vanished. The house felt colder, emptier, darker. It was as though the fun from earlier had given me a false sense of peace. Now everything felt off again, like I was right back where I started. My husband was in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge for a drink. The three guys had come back with us after the park, their voices still echoing through the living room as they recounted the day's events. I stood by the counter, watching him as the fridge light cast strange shadows across his face. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice gave me away. There was a slight tremble in it that I couldn't hide. He turned to me, flashing that same smile, the one that didn't quite meet his eyes. "Yeah, everything's great. Today was fun, huh?" I nodded, but the knot in my stomach was back. Yeah, it was. But the calm I had felt earlier? It was gone, replaced with something else, something darker. I could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, creeping back with every passing second. The easy, carefree mood of earlier seemed like a distant memory, and now, with everyone back in the house, the tension was even more palpable. It was like everything that had been buried was coming to the surface again. My husband, as if sensing the shift, reached across the counter and took my hand. His touch was warm, but it didn't settle the storm brewing inside me. "How about we all relax for a bit? Watch something?" His voice was soft, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. "Sure," I said, though the last thing I wanted was to sit in a room full of people. I just wanted to retreat to the bedroom and be alone, to get some space. But instead, I followed him into the living room and sank down on the couch, between him and one of his friends. The TV flickered on, casting a faint glow in the room, but I wasn't really watching. I kept stealing glances at the men, noticing how their conversation had dropped to a lower volume, how the tension in the room had shifted, becoming more charged. My husband was relaxed, leaning back on the couch, his arm draped casually over my shoulder. It was supposed to be comforting, but instead, it felt suffocating. The man sitting closest to me, the one who had kissed me the night before, shifted closer. I could feel the heat radiating off him even though he wasn't touching me. My pulse quickened. His presence felt more unsettling now than ever. I looked at my husband, waiting for him to say something, anything, to acknowledge what was happening, to see the discomfort on my face. But he didn't. But he didn't say a word. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the screen, that faint, unbothered smile still lingering on his lips. Then, without warning, the man leaned in closer. His breath was warm against my ear. "You liked today, didn't you?" He whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear it, but it still sent a cold shiver down my spine. I forced a smile, my chest tightening. "Yeah, it was fun." He grinned, but his gaze stayed on me, lingering far too long, like he was searching for something I wasn't willing to give. I couldn't look at him any longer. Instead, I focused on the TV, hoping that would be enough to make him stop. But then I felt it, a brief, deliberate touch against my leg. His hand lingering there just a second too long. Panic shot through me. I froze, unable to move. But before I could react, I caught my husband's glance. He saw it. He had to have seen it. And yet, he did nothing. His expression was unreadable. His body relaxed as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening. Everything in me screamed that this wasn't right. But there was no sign from him. No help.
No intervention.
Just silence. I shifted, putting more space between myself and the man, but the feeling didn't go away. It only deepened, like something was about to break, something I couldn't stop. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The air was thick, heavy, and I couldn't breathe properly. I didn't know exactly what was happening, but I knew that I wasn't okay. I needed to leave. "I think I'm going to grab some water," I mumbled, standing up abruptly. No one stopped me as I walked into the kitchen, my mind spinning, my thoughts a whirl of confusion and fear. Once I reached the counter, I braced myself, pressing my palms flat against the cool surface. I took deep, shaky breaths, trying to steady myself. From the other room, I could hear their laughter, the easy chatter filling the house. But it all felt so distant. I couldn't focus on it. I kept replaying the look on my husband's face, the way he hadn't reacted to any of it, the way he let it all slide. Was this what he wanted? Had this been the plan all along? My knuckles turned white as I gripped the counter. This wasn't right. None of this was right. But how could I stop it? I didn't know what to say or how to confront him, or them, without feeling like I was overreacting. Maybe I had let this go on for too long. Maybe I had allowed all of this to happen without setting the boundaries that should have been in place from the start. The sound of footsteps broke through my thoughts. I looked up and saw my husband standing in the doorway. He looked at me, his eyes soft but distant, like he could sense my unease but didn't know what to do with it. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to confront him, tell him about the man's touch, how I felt like I was losing control over everything. But when I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. All I could manage was, "I'm fine." He moved toward me, gently placing his hands on my shoulders. "We're just having a good time. You're overthinking it." His words were supposed to comfort me, but they only made me feel smaller, more unsure. I forced myself to nod. "Yeah, maybe." He smiled, kissed me on the forehead. "Come back to the living room when you're ready. You'll feel better." As he walked away, I stood there, alone in the dimly lit kitchen, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. How had everything gotten so complicated? How had I let it all slip so far out of my hands? And as I watched his silhouette disappear down the hall, one thing was clear. I wasn't ready for whatever was coming next. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of my thoughts pushing down on me. My husband was beside me, breathing steady and deep, already lost in sleep. I turned onto my side away from him, but no matter how hard I tried to push everything out of my mind, it kept coming back. The way he watched me, the way his friend had touched me, and worst of all, the fact that I hadn't said a word. What was happening to us? The next morning, everything was unnervingly quiet. The faint murmur of voices drifted from the living room, but I stayed in bed, dreading the day ahead. My husband eventually got up, leaving me alone in the dim light of the bedroom. I stared at the wall, my mind racing through the events of the last few days. I had let it go on for too long, and now it felt like I was trapped in a situation I couldn't control. I didn't even know how to confront him anymore. I forced myself out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. It was empty, but I could hear my husband and his friends outside, their voices drifting in through the open window. I leaned against the counter, trying to catch snippets of their conversation. It was the same as always, light, casual, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Not for them, but for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just the subtle touches, or the way they looked at me. It was the way my husband acted, like everything was fine. As if he hadn't noticed the shift in our relationship. Or maybe he did notice and just didn't care. That thought made my chest tighten. As the day dragged on, the tension kept growing. The men stayed outside laughing and joking, while I remained in the kitchen, feeling more isolated than ever. My mind replayed everything, the way my husband had suggested spending the day with his friends, how he watched me like he was waiting for something. What was he waiting for? I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to confront him. But as I moved toward the patio door, my legs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. I stood there watching him through the glass, laughing with his friends. They looked so relaxed, so comfortable. I didn't belong in that scene. But I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't ignore the gnawing dread in my chest. Taking a deep breath, I slid open the door and stepped outside. The laughter died down as they noticed me. My husband turned, the same easy smile on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked, but I could see in his eyes, he already knew the answer. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The words were there, stuck in my throat, but I couldn't seem to get them out. The weight of everything, the doubt, the fear, the betrayal, was too much to bear. I stood frozen on the patio, the cool air brushing against my skin, as my husband's question lingered between us like a ghost. "Everything okay?" His smile, so familiar, still there, but his eyes didn't seem to see the cracks I could feel forming beneath the surface. Or maybe he saw them and simply didn't care. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between us stretched on, thick with all the unspoken things that had been building up for days. His friends, once laughing, now quieted as they sensed the shift in the air. I knew I had to say something. I had to make him understand that none of this was okay. That everything had changed. But all I could hear in my mind were the echoes of the past few days, the strange touches, the lingering glances, the moments that felt wrong but went unacknowledged. And always his silence. I don't know who you are anymore. I whispered, my voice so soft, so weak, barely making it past my throat. My chest felt like it was collapsing under the weight of everything I had kept buried for so long. He stood there, still, waiting for me to say something more, but his smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. A concern that felt too late, too calculated. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer, but I took a step back. My mind was racing. "I don't know what this is. What you've turned us into." His eyes widened, a flash of confusion crossing his face. But he didn't respond at first. The silence between us grew, suffocating, and all I could hear was the thudding of my own heart, the pounding in my ears. I waited for him to speak, to say something, anything that would explain him. But nothing came. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the air palpable. Their eyes shifted toward me, but I couldn't focus on them. All I could see was him. The man I thought I knew. The man who now felt like a stranger standing before me. "What are you talking about?" he finally asked, his voice low, too controlled. I gestured around us, my hands trembling, desperate to get the words out. "I'm talking about this." My voice cracked. "All of this. The way you've been watching me, the way you've let them." I stopped, unable to finish. The words lodged in my throat, too heavy to say. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, guilt, recognition, maybe even regret, but it was gone as quickly as it came. His mask slid back into place, and the calm, detached demeanor I had come to dread returned. "You're overreacting," he said softly, but with such finality, it felt like he was speaking to a child who didn't understand the rules of the game. And maybe I didn't. Maybe that was the problem. I shook my head, the tears burning at the corners of my eyes. "No, I'm not. You've changed. We've changed. I don't feel safe anymore. Not with you. Not here." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. But he didn't move. He didn't react. He just stared at me like I was a stranger standing before him. And maybe I was. Maybe we both were. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. His friends watched, frozen, but I couldn't even acknowledge them anymore. It was just him. Just us. Standing on the edge of something I couldn't name, something I couldn't control. And then, in the midst of all that silence, he said it. The words that shattered everything between us. "I thought this was what you wanted." I froze. The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave. What I wanted? No. He couldn't possibly believe that. This couldn't be what I wanted. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw the truth there. He actually believed it. He'd convinced himself that all of this, everything, was part of some unspoken agreement, some twisted fantasy that I was meant to play along with. And in that moment I realized something. He didn't know me at all. The person he thought he was with, the person he thought he could mold, control, that wasn't me. Not anymore. Maybe it never had been. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the air. It was a declaration. The words I'd been avoiding for so long. "I can't stay here. Not with you." For the first time I saw his expression shift. The calm facade cracked just slightly and something flickered there. Panic? Regret? But it was too late. "You don't mean that," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Ido." I turned away and walked into the house, my legs shaky but resolute. I didn't stop to grab my things. I didn't look back. The decision settled on me like a weight, but it felt right. I reached the front door, my hand hovering over the handle, and for a moment I hesitated. The air outside was cold, sharp against my skin. The sky above was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold air, feeling the chill seep into my bones. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do. But as I walked down the empty street, the echo of my footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness, I realized something for the first time in so long. I felt free. And that terrified me more than anything.